You are listening to Despair by Michael Brockbank, Episode 20. Wellshire wasn't necessarily a small town, but it was much smaller than Witcham. There were times when Riley would find himself lost in the alleyways and side roads leading to various homes and farms in Witcham. This new town was considerably easier to manage. As Riley had a decent working knowledge of herbalism and brewing, it didn't take long for him to find work in the local chemist shop. Weston Catfell, the owner of the shop, took pity on the young man after hearing Riley's story. Upon his arrival, the young wizard spent a great deal of time trying to gain his bearings. Since most of the herbal shops Master Galen had taken him to were owned and operated by mystic folk, Riley thought it would be a good place to start looking for his mentor. That's when he met Weston, a much older man, with quite a long white beard stretching halfway down his body. He was a short, thin frame of a man who had obviously seen quite a bit of history unfold before him. Although the shopkeeper wasn't able to point Riley in the right direction, he did offer the young man a room and employment for as long as he needed. Weston was merely grateful he found someone who knew the difference between grass and sage. He was getting too old to man the shop alone and felt Riley had a trustworthy aura about him. This was aside from the fact that Weston was intrigued by the young man's tale and was curious about how it will end. Riley had been cleaning the bookshelves while taking note of the different volumes. If he had ever wanted to dive deeper into herbalism or crafting potions and salves of any kind, this was surely the place to find information. He had not seen such a collection since his master took him to Yarksburg a year earlier. Putting a handful of books back onto a freshly dusted shelf, the door to the shop opened. It triggered the hanging bell that rested above the doorframe, and in walked an unlikely pair. A taller man, dressed in black leather garb, stepped into the shop, followed by a much younger girl. She was obviously trying to hide her face behind her companion for some unknown reason. "Good day to you," Weston said, walking into the shop from an adjacent room. His gait was slow and stiff, with a slight limp on his left side. Although moving about was a great chore for the elderly man, he always seemed to have a smile on his face and had the presence that he truly enjoyed life in all of its splendor. "And good day to you," the man in leathers replied, walking into the room. As Riley slid the last of the books onto the shelf, he looked back to see a nicely crafted silver axe hanging from the man's belt. Riley began thinking about how it was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship when he heard a voice in his head. "Thinking of replacing me already?" Narok asked the young man. While the magical dagger was upstairs in Riley's room, he found that Narok could communicate with him over short distances. And although Weston didn't strike Riley as being judgmental or suspicious, the young wizard felt that hiding Narok's true nature would be best for the time being. After all, he didn't want others to think he was mentally ill. Riley didn't answer his dagger friend, but instead let out a sigh and walked over to Weston's side to help him saunter to the wooden counter. What can we do for you?" Weston's breath was a bit shallow, thanks to the difficulty of moving about. He placed a shaking hand on Riley's shoulder to help brace himself. "I'm not sure if you can, but perhaps you can point me in the right direction," the man said, reaching into a satchel and retrieving a book. "What can you tell me about this?" Weston took the ancient tome from the man and carefully examined its cover and binding. "Well, this is an old book." "I dare say it's older than I am," the shopkeeper replied with a chuckle. It wasn't until he opened the book to view its contents that his tone immediately changed. From what he could tell, the pages were, indeed, older than he was. Riley had knelt down next to Weston, searching through the shelves of the counter for a piece of glass. It was a spherical lens imbued with the ability to give the user a close approximation of the age of any object within its view. It was a Catfell family heirloom passed on by generations and still functioned as well as it did when it was first constructed. Riley felt that it was part of his job to anticipate the needs of his employer and knew Weston was going to ask for the lens. Just as Riley found it under a pile of rags, the shopkeeper's hand reached down for the piece of glass. The young man placed it into his hand and stood up. "We found it in the woods," the young girl spoke up from behind the man. Her eyes locked with Riley's as she shied away to hide behind her protector once again. As Weston began scanning over the pages with the lens, Riley got a better look at the writing style of the text. There was something incredibly familiar about the structure and flow, but he couldn't quite capture it from where he had seen the text before. "I was right, lad. This book is very, very old, but I don't recognize the writing," Weston said as he began turning the pages. With each flip of the parchment, Riley felt as though he was getting closer to understanding the text. Finally, as Weston stopped on a particularly gruesome page detailing the internal organs of a humanoid, a single phrase seemed to jump out at the young wizard: "The destructiveness of fire." It was written in a special code created by Master Galen. "I do," Riley chirped up with overwhelming excitement. "Where did you find this?" As the girl said, "In the forest. I came across an abandoned manor a couple of days ago." Abandoned? Riley knew that Galen would never just leave one of his books behind unless something happened to him. "Son, this book was written hundreds of years ago. Are you sure you recognize it?" Weston asked, looking up at the young man. "Hundreds?" Riley asked with an incredible surprise. Master Galen wasn't that old, and the young wizard knew that was his mentor's handwriting. 600 or so, actually." "That's impossible," Narok voiced. "It can't be." The young man's excitement quickly transitioned to bewilderment. He was positive that was Master Galen's book, yet the lens detected the book as being more than 6 centuries old. As far as he knew, the lens was always correct. "Is there any way you can tell me the book's context?" the leather-clad man asked Riley. "Not offhand. I can make out a few of the words and symbols, but I have to study it a bit." Riley's head hung low as he tried to understand the vast age of the book. It hadn't been a month since Master Galen shoved him through the mirror. The man looked down at the book with concern. Weston could tell that it was something of great importance to him. "Would you be willing to translate it for the gentleman?" the shopkeeper asked, looking over at his young apprentice. "I could. It might take me a bit of time, though," the young wizard replied, lifting his head to face the stranger. "Can you take me to where you found the book? It might help if I understood the context behind where you actually came across it." The man stood for a moment, glancing at the young man. It seemed as though he was trying to peer into Riley's soul for some kind of answer. "We could work a trade. Translate the book, and I'll take you to where I found it." His voice sounded trustworthy. Not to mention, having Narok at his side gave Riley a great deal of courage. "I can translate some of it as we travel." "I hope you know what you're doing," Narok said as Riley fixated on the man's eyes. After a moment of consideration, the man let out a deep sigh. "Agreed," he said, looking back at the young girl. "Not to interrupt your haggling skills, but there's something wrong," Narok said with concern. "I feel a dark presence nearby."